Welcome, and thank you all for coming to our session on literacy and the science of reading. My name is Laurence Pichot, and I will be your host today alongside Nirmala Patni. I don't know if you see her on the screen. I don't see all the faces. She's our Education VP representing PTA Council. Bienvenidos a todos. Si necesitan ayuda para entender la conferencia, por favor, dale un clic en el botón de interpretación y para tener la traducción. This event is being organized by Palo Alto CSC and PTA Council to celebrate Dyslexia Awareness Month and chime into the national conversation happening around literacy at the moment. I'm a board member of CSC, focusing on reading, and I recently represented parents in the dyslexia working group tasked with implementing the California guidelines in PAUSD. We've gathered here today in an effort to bridge the gap that exists between the reading research and the classroom. Let me explain what I mean. In California, only 32% of fourth graders are above or at proficiency in reading, as defined by the National Assessment of Education Progress. Unfortunately, it doesn't improve. In 8th grade last year, only 30% were proficient. And this is true across the US. In Palo Alto, our last writing assessment showed that 28% of our middle schoolers fell below benchmark in writing. While those numbers are daunting, science researchers have solutions, and there is a methodology to help struggling readers and writers. It is therefore a huge honor for me to introduce Jason and Rebecca, who are dedicating their work to inform us how kids learned to read, write, and spell. I am immensely grateful they graciously volunteer their time to be with us today. Jason is an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Education in the Division of Developmental and Behavioral Pediatrics. He started a dyslexia research lab at the University of Washington 5 years ago and moved his lab to Stanford last year. They currently have a series of online experiments and soon will be launching studies that involve intensive intervention for children with dyslexia. I highly recommend. Both my kids are doing it and not both of them are dyslexic. Rebecca is an associate professor of early literacy in the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Her research focuses on language and literacy development. She's currently working with the Department of Education on developing the state literacy plan. So the way it's going to work is Jason is going to start the conversation by presenting how the reading brain works from a neuroscience perspective. And then Rebecca will explain how to apply the science of reading into the classroom. If you have any questions, please formulate them in the Q&A button. There should be a box. And we will have 15 minutes after each session to go over your questions. The slides are going to be available. And if you're interested, you simply need to fill in your name, contact details in the Google Doc that we've placed into the chat. Now, without further ado, big round of applause for Jason.
All right. There we go. Am I unmuted now? Okay. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for coming this evening. So I moved to Stanford about a year ago, and the goal of my lab, I would say in one sentence, is to foster a virtuous cycle between education and neuroscience. Most of my studies that are going on in my lab, well, actually this was a picture of a study going on in the lab before the pandemic started, as you might have all guessed. Most of my studies used to look roughly like this. And on the one hand, we would use education as a tool to understand how experience shapes brain development. Many people in my lab have interest in basic neuroscience, understanding how children's brains develop, how the development of brain circuits is shaped by different environmental factors. And so by working in an educational context, this gives the neuroscientists in my lab a lot of power to change aspects of the educational environment and study how that sculpts the circuits of the developing child's brain. Now, on the other hand, we also hope to take this knowledge we gain through neuroscience research and apply it as a tool to predict and personalize learning. So we hope to develop personalized education programs that leverage the detailed information we can gain from brain imaging to improve the way education is delivered to individual children. So that's the summary of what my lab does in a minute. And the goal of my talk is to answer 4 questions. And as I lay these out, it might seem like a lofty goal, maybe more of a graduate course than a 30-minute seminar, but let's see how I can do on all these. So first, I want to introduce you to the idea of how the brain learns to read. So by the end of this talk, next time you get asked how does the brain learn to read, I hope you can at least give a brief response to that. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what is different about the dyslexic brain. Next, we'll get into the question, maybe the most important question of this talk. Can we change the brain through education? To the teachers that are on the webinar here, I want you all to appreciate the impact of the work that you do in the classroom. And then finally, I want to give a little bit of information about how we actually measure brain development. Part of my lab also is a group of engineers that are working on new, quick and non-invasive methods to actually examine how children's brain development is unfolding over time. So I'm going to try to communicate a little bit of the methods that we use as well. Okay. So first off, let's all consider the challenge of learning to read and what this means for young children. So this photo now is a couple years old. And what I want everyone to appreciate is that the 2 people in this photo see fundamentally different things. And they will continue to see fundamentally different things for years. As I stare at this book with my daughter, this is now taken 3 years ago almost, wow. I can't help but hear the sounds of language, hear the rich story and the dialogue communicated by the different animals in this book. Whereas to her, it just looks like a series of pretty pictures. And for years now, this was about a year after that first photo was taken when she could start talking to me and emphatically say, "Dada, read a book." She had learned how to speak, how to comprehend language, how to produce language. I should have gotten a newer picture of her. She's 3.5 now, and loves speaking, talking, being read to. But still, looking at this page, the symbols are completely meaningless to her. So this is an important point for everyone to appreciate, that literacy was invented by modern societies. Our brains are not pre-wired for reading. Unlike spoken language, whereby being in a rich linguistic environment, my daughter naturally picked up how to speak. I never had to teach her the movements of the tongue and articulate her muscles to produce speech sounds. She was able to pick this up on her own. Literacy, on the other hand, is the neural circuits in your brain that allow you to be literate are constructed in response to education. This means that your ability to become literate depends on your brain's capacity for plasticity, your brain's ability to be shaped by experiences that you have. Now, from this perspective, the fact that our brains did not evolve for literacy, it may come as no surprise that many children struggle learning to read, and this is what we call dyslexia. So I want to focus on this key point. It's going to be a key point throughout my talk, is how education actually shapes the brain development. I want to do this by looking at an image of what's going on in my brain versus my young daughter's brain as we stare at this book together. That as I open the first page and we look at this picture of a bunny rabbit, the first thing that happens is signals from our eyes are sent to the very back of our brain. The back of the brain is called the visual cortex. This is the part of your brain that analyzes the visual world, allows you to, for example, recognize that you're looking at a bunny rabbit. And this happens through a series of elegant operations done by neural circuits towards the back of the brain. And for all intents and purposes, it's largely similar in my brain and my 1-year-old daughter's here. However, as soon as my eyes move to the first word on the page, this is where things are fundamentally different in our 2 brains. Whereas for me, specialized regions that are involved in recognizing visual words become active and immediately, within milliseconds, start sending signals to parts of my brain that evolved for speech perception and speech production for spoken language. In my daughter's brain, the information stops in the visual system. It doesn't get communicated to this circuitry that we have for spoken language. Now, of course, I'm not just flipping through the pages and reading to myself. I'm reading out loud to my daughter. So as I start reading out loud, now the language circuitry in her brain becomes active as she listens to the spoken language. So one way you can think about literacy is that becoming literate means plugging your visual system into the parts of your brain that evolved for language capacities. Okay, so 3 points to remember throughout the rest of this talk. First is that becoming literate prompts the development of specialized circuits for transforming vision, in this case letters, into language or speech sounds. Second, in the literate brain, written words are processed like spoken words. And third, the development of the circuit goes awry in some children, and this is what we refer to as dyslexia. So we can ask the next question, what is different about the dyslexic brain? And to get at that, let's quickly review what the brain must achieve, what the brain must learn to do in order to achieve literacy. Now, as I briefly summarized in those last slides, first, your brain has to rapidly recognize this complex visual pattern in front of you. Anyone that's looking at my slides, your brain is doing this incredibly well. It then must convert these visual symbols to speech sounds before it can associate these sounds with their meanings. So learning to read means your brain has to learn to coordinate these very different brain systems. And one key takeaway point that science has taught us over the last decade is that efficient brain wiring, essentially these arrows in this diagram on the left, are essential for reading, allowing information to flow between these different brain regions. So one thing that studies in my lab have shown over the last 5 years is that one of the critical foundations of skilled reading is these connections between different brain regions. So what I'm showing in this slide on the right here is a rendering of 2 particularly important brain connections. The one in blue connects together key language circuits in your brain. The one in orange allows signals from your visual cortex to be sent up to the rest of the brain. And the rendering of these connections in the human brain, these are called white matter tracks for those that are interested in the neuroscience of it. You can think of them as an analogy to this image of a NASA supercomputer, where these bundles of wires connecting together the different processing nodes of the computer allow information to be shared between different parts of the computer, similar to how these bundles of wires in the human brain allow information, for example, to make it from the visual centers of your brain to the parts of your brain that are involved in language. So this part of the brain is called the white matter. It's brain tissue containing these connections between different parts of the brain. Now, one thing that research has shown us is that when we collect brain imaging data using magnetic resonance imaging and we examine children with dyslexia, we see subtle differences in the way these brain connections are developing. So one question that comes from this research, as we see there's differences in the way that dyslexic brain is structured, we can then ask, well, can we change this wiring? Can we intervene through an intervention program to actually change how the brain is connected together? So I'm going to show some data from a recent study that was just finished as my lab was moving from the University of Washington down to Stanford. I want to thank all the incredible folks who worked on the various components of this study, our collaborators at Lindenwood Bell, our various funding sources, Jacobs Foundation, Microsoft, NSF, and National Institute of Health. And what we did in this study was we recruited 26 children with dyslexia for an intensive summer reading intervention program. This was done in collaboration with Lindenwood Bell. And the intervention involved 4 hours a day of one-on-one training, 5 days a week for 8 weeks. So this was a highly intensive one-on-one personalized intervention program. And Rebecca, in her talk, is going to talk a little bit more about the various components of good reading curriculum. So briefly, this involved training on the various building blocks of literacy, segmenting and blending speech sounds, building and deconstructing words with various letter combinations, working on decoding new words, and slowly building up greater reading fluency. As children were going through this intervention program, we also had a control group that went through business as usual, so did not go through the intervention. And every couple weeks, the children would come into my lab and we would make measurements of different aspects of reading accuracy, rate, fluency, and then we would also make measurements of brain connectivity with diffusion MRI, which is a very cool technology that I'll talk about a little bit in a couple slides. So looking at the behavioral data, this is showing one child's growth trajectory through the intervention program. So on this axis here, I'm showing a measure called basic reading skills. This is a measure of single word reading abilities, how complex a word children can read. And on this axis, I'm showing time, how many hours they'd spent in the intervention program. I'm showing one child's trajectory who started off towards the bottom of this test, severely impaired in reading, and showed systematic and rapid growth over time. I can show data from the other children in this study. You can see they all came in below average and showed, all of them showed improvement over time. And on average, we saw children going from about the 10th to the 30th percentile. This is about 1 grade level of change over the course of the summer. We also saw highly variable growth, though, with some children showing transformative change over the course of the summer and others showing more limited growth. And that's a point I'll return back to at the end. So looking at different measures of reading skills, we saw improvements in all the different aspects of reading: reading accuracy, reading speed, reading fluency, reading comprehension. Quickly to summarize these results, these plots over here are showing the amount of growth in reading accuracy in orange versus reading fluency in blue, and reading speed in green. So you can see there's improvements to differing extents across all these measures. And no improvements in math scores, so the intervention was focused on reading abilities that make sense, that these children did not improve in math scores over the course of their summer vacation. So one question we might ask is, what about the children with the greatest struggles? There's been a number of scientists who have worried that these types of educational interventions might be highly effective only for children with, might not be effective for the children with the greatest struggles. So we can look at that by looking at each child's reading ability when they began the study, so this being children who are relatively less impaired, versus these children over here who are the ones that are showing the greatest reading difficulties. And here I'm plotting how much improvement each child is showing over the course of the intervention. So these are the children up here who are actually coming in with the lowest reading scores and showing the most improvement. So what this shows is these intervention programs can be highly effective even for the children with the greatest struggles at the beginning of the intervention. Okay, so now I'm going to dive into the brain imaging data. We're going to turn back to this question asking how an intensive intervention program like this actually might reshape brain development. And I see a raised hand. I'm going to ask the other moderators here if I should answer questions during or wait until the end.
I think we should just wait until the end.
Okay. I'll take questions at the end then. So how do we measure brain conductivity? For those that haven't come into a study in my lab, most of our studies, or many of our studies, involve magnetic resonance imaging. And this is a picture of an MRI machine. Many of you may have had MRIs for various reasons. I had my first MRI on my back for a high school sports injury. And since then, since running a brain imaging lab, have been in this machine hundreds of times, if not more now. And we use this same MRI machine or scanner to measure many different properties of the brain. So one type of magnetic resonance imaging is called structural MRI. And this measures the structure of the brain. It's kind of like a picture of the brain that you would used to be seeing. And it's the same technology that would be used to measure, for example, when I tore a disc in my back in high school, to take a picture of that disc to see where damage might be. Another type of MRI that you've probably seen, at least in the popular media, is functional MRI. This is a measure of blood flow that results from neural activity. So as neurons become active, we're able to image where blood is flowing in the brain. And that gives us a picture of the function of the brain as, for example, children do a task like reading. Now, finally, a method that my lab uses a lot is called diffusion MRI. And this measures the connections between different brain regions. It measures the wires that connect different brain regions together. And this is going to be the measure that we're going to be using in this study to track how the brain is actually changing as children learn over the course of the summer. So to give, yes?
Sorry, actually, it was a clarifying question. Would you mind saying how old were the kids that were involved in this study?
Oh, great question. They were 7 through 13 years of age. So there is a pretty large age distribution. Yes, and I'll open up to the moderators. Feel free to interrupt me if there's a question that I should answer during the talk. Okay, so this technology of diffusion MRI, it's a non-invasive MRI measurement that indexes the flow of water through the brain. And you might ask yourself, why are we interested in the flow of water through the brain? So I'll give you an analogy to think of. If we think of those white matter connections, there's pretty rendering of connections across the brain, like the brain's plumbing system. And we're measuring the rate of water diffusion. You might imagine a leaky pipe like this, where there's a lot of water diffusion. So in this case, there's a lot of water just diffusing, moving out through this pipe, versus a more insulated pipe here, where there's less water diffusion. And so one of the things these types of measures can give us is a peek at the insulation of the brain's plumbing. Now, if we are in Silicon Valley here, so there's probably someone that's more interested in computers than plumbing. Another analogy you can think about is the bandwidth of an internet connection. As our measures of water diffusion go down in the brain, it's indexing wires being more densely packed together, thinking about it like a higher bandwidth internet connection. Okay. So this is what these studies look like. Someone will lie in the MRI machine, and what we're measuring is the physical structure, the wiring of the brain. So this is a picture of the way the brain is physically wired together, not a picture of brain activity. And what this means is that while children are in the study, they can watch their favorite video. This is actually from a couple of years ago. During one of the last studies, there was a big SpongeBob craze. So that was like the video of choice. Now Frozen is the new one that everyone wants to watch while being in the scanner. So the data comes off the scanner. It looks something like this, maybe not that interesting on its own. People in the lab, we write software pipelines to take these data and identify specific brain connections. And what we get from this is measures of water diffusion. It's a measure of insulation or packing of wires within each individual's brain. So we can now turn back to our question about how an intervention program like this is shaping brain development. We're going to zoom in on one of those pathways that I briefly showed at the beginning, a pathway connecting language regions of the brain together. It's known as the arcuate fasciculus. And here's a measure of water diffusion when these children come in at the baseline right before the intervention begins. And within the first couple weeks of the intervention program, we already see a highly significant decrease in water diffusion. Remember that a decrease in water diffusion means an increase in the insulation of the brain's piping or wires. And this persists over the course of the intervention program. When we compare this to our control group, we see a highly significant decrease in water diffusion in the subjects going through our intervention with no change in the control group. So going back to our analogy, what we're seeing is less water diffusion outside of the pipes. This is indicative of the brain kind of better insulating these connections over time. And one of the important inferences is, and I think this is a really key point for any of the teachers in the room particularly, is that you're going through these, an intensive evidence-based intervention program or education program in general is shaping the physical structure of the brain, sculpting the way the brain is connected together. It's not just teaching a struggling child how to work around their difficulties. It's actually building up new circuitry to do incredible things. So we can zoom out, and this is showing a heat map of a bunch of different brain connections. And I'll just quickly summarize this, that we don't see changes just localized to one little piece of brain tissue. We see these changes widespread throughout much of the brain. The heat map is showing the amount of change we see in different brain connections. And since we're using MRI to look at the brain over time, we actually see these changes in each individual's brain track their learning throughout this educational intervention program. Okay, so a couple takeaways. First, reading difficulties are associated with differences in brain connectivity. Even in children with severe dyslexia, interventions are highly successful. Okay, so we can look at children's brain development unfolding over time. We can see differences that are associated with reading skills, but even in the children with the strongest struggles, we can see these interventions are highly effective. The main finding from some of this recent work in my lab is that intensive interventions change the connections of the brain's reading circuitry. We actually see changes in the physical way the brain is connected together. So a couple important takeaways from this is that education is actually shaping brain development. The work teachers are doing in the classroom is, I like to say that teachers are brain engineers. They're at the front lines of sculpting the circuits of children's brains to be able to accomplish incredible things in the classroom and beyond. And finally, it's critical to get children in evidence-based intervention programs for those that need it. Things that's coming out of my lab's research, as well as many other labs, is how effective these interventions can be, particularly when children get into them early on. So far, I've really talked about this end of the curve of studying children in educational settings and understanding how differences in the educational environment actually reshape developmental changes in the brain. And where we are going over the next 5 years, 5 to 10 years, is thinking about how we can use neuroscience as a tool to predict learning and personalize education. So this is an idea that's broadly been captured under the term precision education. Most people here have probably heard the term precision medicine. This has been a major push in medicine to tailor medical treatments to the unique characteristics of the individual. And similarly, we'd like to develop methods to better understand differences among children, differences among how children learn, to try to develop personalized, tailored education programs for the needs of an individual. So I'd say our goal is to ask, can we predict individual differences in learning and prescribe the optimal intervention for an individual? And unfortunately, I can't answer that question this evening, but I'll say stay tuned. This is one of the major studies that my lab was launching when we made the move here to Stanford. Unfortunately, the current state of the world has delayed that slightly, but with an optimistic hope that we'll be returning to normal over the next some number of months. I wanted to quickly introduce the types of things that we have planned for this coming year. So one of our major studies that I just mentioned there is looking at brain plasticity, learning, and long-term outcomes from dyslexia intervention programs. We're hoping to be starting that again soon, as hopefully with an optimistic future of the current pandemic. We also have a series of studies that are fully online. So since we've all been at home and on Zoom and on the internet, we've been embracing new technologies to develop assessment tools through the web browser. And one of the visions here is having fast, reliable, totally automated assessment tools to be able to provide equitable access to assessments regardless of what school district or school or the means that any particular family has, where children can play a game through the web browser and we can get a very precise picture. For example, the reading ability can be able to track improvements over time without teachers and school districts needing to invest all the time and resources in administering time-intensive in-person assessments. The other component of this online research right now is designing new assessments to better characterize the underlying mechanisms that are contributing to reading difficulties. So once again, through experiments that we can now run totally automatically through the web browser, we're hoping to develop ways to characterize the nuances of an individual's development. And the goal is to work towards a better understanding of learning differences and what contribute to the vast differences in how children progress through the educational environment. So that's a snapshot of a couple of the big studies. Hopefully in-person studies will be coming back over the next couple months, but we have a series of online studies that we're very excited about right now. For those of the school districts, will be open to, our hope is that all the online software we develop is available completely free, and hopefully we'll be able to support it too for any schools or teachers that find any of this useful. And of course, I want to thank you all for coming this evening and the incredible people that have run various aspects of these studies over the last couple of years, as well as our funders who have allowed us to conduct this research. And finally, I'll be posting all these slides at the lab website, easy to remember, dyslexia.stanford.edu. And there's more information if anyone's interested in signing up to participate in studies. So thank you all, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Jason. So we do have a few questions. I'll start with the question that are related to this study. One was, which method do you use to check the participant literacy baseline?
So we used a bunch of different, in that era, in-person assessments. So the Woodcock-Johnson Basic Reading Skills Index and reading fluency measures. We also used the test of word reading efficiency. We use the GORT to measure reading comprehension. And then we also have a series of measures that we've developed in the lab to characterize very similar things, both kind of slight different nuances.
Okay, and then did you check the participants after 8 weeks?
Did we check them in what way?
Did you check the participant after 8 weeks?
Like, did we look at their reading abilities?
Yes, I'm sure. I think this person probably needs to clarify because, yes,
so kids came into the lab before the intervention and every 2 weeks, and then after the intervention, and so that's how we were able to see that their reading skills improved by roughly a grade level or a little more, and that was also the basis for seeing the changes in the brain. Yeah, so we see them over the whole course of the intervention and also afterwards.
And did you check it? Maybe that's what the question is. Did you check it post 1 year?
No, but that's one of the goals of our the new studies we're launching here is to look at the long-term outcomes. So that last study was finishing up right as we were the lab was moving from University of Washington back to Stanford, and in this next round of studies, we really want to understand how these short-term intervention programs play out over the longer run, and to what extent individual differences emerge over its longer time scale, and yeah, I guess I'll stop there.
Yes, we have a lot of questions. So our district uses the Lucy Calkins curriculum for elementary reading. Is this program backed by the science of reading?
You know, I'm going to turn over questions on curricula to Rebecca. That's really her area of expertise. So maybe I'll turn that over to her either at the beginning or at the end of her talk.
Rebecca, how do you feel? Do you feel comfortable answering this question now, or would you prefer to go through your slides and do it afterwards?
Let's do it at the end so I can refer back to them.
Okay. The other question is, why do you see a correlation between these underdeveloped brains and ADHD?
You know, so my lab doesn't study ADHD at all, but we have a lot of great colleagues here that do. And actually, that's one of the goals of our next series of studies. The way science often works is that you have labs with particular expertise and focusing on a specific area. My lab is reading and dyslexia. But we have some great colleagues in the med school. So half of my faculty appointment is in the Grad School of Education. The other half is in the School of Medicine. And I have a lot of close colleagues over there studying ADHD. And we're working to bridge our research program. And that's one of the also big goals of the online tools that we're developing is having quicker measures to be able to characterize like many different aspects of children's development. So yeah, that'll be in the future, but I can't say much now.
A follow-up question. So I don't know if you have any information for this parent, but do you know if this intervention can also be effective on executive functioning?
You know, we haven't looked at that. I feel like I'm giving the same answer. I'm sorry, this isn't intended, but yes, that's also one of the other things that we're going to be looking at in this next round of studies is looking at the other skills that improve over the course of these intervention programs. No curriculum really focuses on one specific thing. There's many aspects of, so the kids learn to pay attention better. I think there's also a lot of emotional support. A lot of the kids that entered the study, just the idea of going to school every day was so difficult for them. After particularly the older ones who'd been struggling for so many years, and there's a whole component of emotional support that they get from the teachers they're working with here. So kind of all those other factors are a big goal that we hope to understand over the next couple of years.
So Jason, the next question was, what was the intensive program you used, and how did you get children to work on this program for 4 hours a day?
Yeah, so this was done in collaboration with Lynn Mood Bell. The program was Seeing Stars, yes, how do you get kids to work on that for 4 hours a day for 8 weeks of summer vacation? And a big part of it is that the teachers they have are fabulous. They connect with the kids on their level, and they make it fun. And there's breaks, there's games too. It's not just sitting and working on these skills for every moment of the day. They do a great job at keeping it fun. And honestly, a lot of the kids that came into this program, the parents were the ones that were more excited about it at the beginning of the summer. But pretty much across the board, all the kids were very excited about it as the summer went on.
We have another question about vision therapy. I have heard some do vision therapy for reading disability and dyslexia. Is it significantly meaningful? Is a child with brain-based vision impairment, does that affect for reading and literacy learning in terms of information processing in the brain?
I think there's I'll maybe ask Rebecca to comment on this too. My read of the literature is that there's no evidence that vision therapy is helpful for children with dyslexia. And I don't know, Rebecca, do you have any other opinions on that?
That's my reading of the literature as well. I haven't done specific research on that myself, but yes, I agree.
Yeah, there's a review paper that came out in the journal Pediatrics, I want to say in 2012. I can try to post a link to it on my lab webpage if someone can remind me to follow up on that. That went through the dozens of studies that have looked at vision therapy for dyslexia, and they came to the conclusion that there is no scientific evidence behind it. But that's my read of what others have done, not my own research. So I'll try to post that paper.
By when will the online assessment be available?
That's a great question. So we're running research studies to collect norms on it right now. We're happy to partner with school districts that are interested in partnering with us on research as we develop the norms for this. And then we're also looking for funding sources right now, because our goal is to be able to offer a free service where anyone that wants to use this can just use it free of charge. And we're looking for funding sources to cover like the various web hosting fees and all that kind of stuff. So hopefully early next year. I mean, I would say like right now it's in the research phase. Hopefully early next year it's in the you can use this phase.
Great question that we have. Do you see differences in results for children who struggle with rapid automatic naming versus phonemic awareness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we looked at that in our intervention data, and across the board, the intervention was equally successful, irrespective of whether the child had a larger difficulty with phonological awareness versus rapid automatized naming. So another way to say that is like baseline scores on either of those tests were not predictive of who improved in the intervention program. The one major predictor, when we looked at predicting individual differences, was that it was actually more effective for children who were had larger struggles, so just lower reading scores. And the other thing that, as I mentioned, we're working on this very much in the research pipeline, is that there were some aspects of the brain that we could measure before the intervention that predicted the amount of success that an individual would show. So that's one of the things we're following up on in current research is hopefully developing automated ways to get a snapshot of the brain and be able to say, well, this is going to be the best intervention approach for this child. But that's, once again, not a current thing, a vision for the coming years.
And a follow-up question on the rapid automatic naming. Have you measured whether the study had an impact on rapid automatic naming?
We did not. Sorry, I was thinking back that we did not measure. We measured rapid automatic naming at baseline. We did not measure it at the end of the intervention. Our main outcome was reading abilities. So.
There were some questions about being part of your study, Jason. How do they, if they would like to be a part of your study?
So basically, the way we have a web page where parents can sign parents can sign up if you're interested in being notified when there's studies that your kid might qualify for. And so that's at, if you just go to dyslexia.stanford.edu, there's a participate, sign up for our research database is the first thing you'll see there. We have a series of questionnaires, and then we always, based on what parents indicate they might be interested in, and then what we're currently looking for various studies, we send an email whenever there's a study that your kid would qualify for. So yeah, if you're interested in being notified, just go there and fill out the various questionnaires.
We have a technical question. And is your analogy to insulation in the discussion of white matter related to efficiency?
Yeah, I think that's a good way to think about it. That you know, as connections in the brain get more insulated, they're able to more efficiently send signals faster and more accurately. So the analogy to like internet bandwidth is probably a good one. That, you know, as we see these decreases in diffusion, you can think of it as like a increase in the bandwidth of your internet connection. Something we've all been investing in since the Zoom era, where that's our most important tool.
Another way to look at it, I'm sure you've seen that a lot of the research going around how the need to develop automatic phonemic awareness. So would the insulation and automaticity be also linked to?
That's kind of the idea that us and many other people are working with. Yeah, is that it really ends up being important for automatizing.
Okay. I think we should just we have so many questions. So maybe one last, we had a few questions about if you had any suggestions on intervention programs.
You know, I never like to give opinions on specific curriculum. There's a lot of really good ones, and I think maybe that's a good segue to Rebecca. Actually, perfect segue to question, to thinking about, you know, what are the components that you should be looking for.
Yes, let's do that. And maybe, Jason, if you're okay, I can collect those questions and you and I can sit down and then maybe I can circulate them afterwards.
Yeah, maybe I'll try to post my slides, and if I can find some time, make a blog post on the final questions at dyslexia.stanford.edu. I'll try to get to that in the next week or so.
Thank you so much. So, well, now that you've heard from Jason that basically the brain is a muscle, it can be trained, it can be patched, we can improve automaticity and efficiency. Basically, Rebecca is going to be telling us what we can do in the classroom so that our kids develop those foundational reading and writing skills. She's also going to show us how we can monitor those in the classroom and what we can do to understand our kids' learning profile and what we can do to support them. Rebecca, you're on.
Great, thank you. So quick introduction. I just wanted you to know that I am a former teacher and I now conduct research on supporting diverse learners who struggle in literacy. And sorry, I'm just trying to get this off my screen. And I'm also a mother of 3 children in PAUSD. So I have a middle schooler who's at JLS, and I have 2 elementary school students who are at Nixon. I want to sort of segue from Jason's to my talk, and just kind of framing that Jason was really specifically focused on dyslexia. So those are children who have reading struggles that are often related more to decoding, but sometimes because of decoding issues also affect comprehension. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit and talk about the reading process in general, and some of the things that we're learning about that as well in terms of the science of reading, as well as how parents can be engaged in supporting literacy at home. So with that, I want to give you a framework that is often used in the science of reading literature. It's called the simple view of reading and writing. And it's just kind of, again, a simple way to think about what reading is and what writing is. And so in the simple view, reading comprehension is a product of decoding. So that's putting the sounds and letters together, as well as listening comprehension. And so this is our ability to understand the meaning of the words that we hear. And so you really need both of those two very important things to be able to comprehend and learn from text. Similarly, writing proficiency is a combination of encoding and ideation. Encoding is our ability to put the sounds of the language into print when we write. And ideation is being able to think of the ideas and organize the ideas that we want to be able to communicate with proficiency. So of course, it's a very simple view. It can be complicated. And so this is the reading rope that it's referred to by Hollis Scarborough developed this a number of years back. But it kind of can show you how the language comprehension and the word recognition skills and the simple view of reading can be broken down. So within language comprehension, there's background knowledge, vocabulary, language structures, verbal reasoning, literacy knowledge. And in word recognition, there's phonological awareness, decoding, sight word recognition. And these things all develop somewhat separately in the beginning as kids are picking up these individual skills. And then over time and through instruction, kids begin to intertwine these and they become increasingly strategic and increasingly automatic to become skilled readers who are fluent at coordinating word recognition and text comprehension. There's a similar model for writing where ideation is kind of composed of knowledge of text structure, word choice, sentence structure, organization, and writing process. And the transcription, or sort of the encoding side of things, involves spelling, handwriting, and keyboarding, and punctuation. And again, these things become increasingly strategic and automatic over time and lead to children becoming skilled writers. Why is it important to sort of work on these skills early? Because for kids who are beginning readers, kids who are good at that early and have some of those foundational skills really well mastered, they're able to pick up reading more quickly. And as they read, they become more automatic. They learn more from what they're reading and they begin to read at a faster pace. And so they actually grow at a faster rate than kids who have difficulty in some of the areas that were mentioned on the previous slides. Because any struggles that a kid has is going to slow them down a little bit and it's going to impair their ability to learn more from the reading process. And so when we think about this, we call this, sorry to be so bleak, but the downward spiral that can happen with early literacy. If kids are struggling, they might not have enjoyment in reading. They don't get enough practice. They don't develop that automaticity. Reading becomes unpleasant. Then if they're not reading, they don't get more vocabulary from their reading. They have a poor attitude toward reading and toward school. It affects their motivation to read. And if they don't read, they're not going to get better at it. So that's kind of what we're trying to avoid through focusing on early literacy practices. So what do we know about how to support early literacy? If we take the point that focusing on literacy early is important, what does the science tell us about how to support early literacy? So these are recommendations that are provided by the Institute of Education Sciences, which is part of the Department of Education. And IES has requisitioned these syntheses of research in order to identify what does the evidence tell us related to specific things in all areas of education, but has been pretty active in the area of literacy in particular. And so this is the recommendations that IES provides for supporting foundational skills for reading for understanding. And these are specifically related to the kindergarten through third grade age range. So the 4 things that they recommend are that we should be teaching students academic language, including use of inferential and narrative language, and also supporting vocabulary knowledge. We should be developing awareness of the segments of speech and sound and how they link to letters. We should be teaching students to decode words, analyze parts of words, and write and recognize words. And then finally, we should be ensuring that students are reading connected text every day to support accuracy, fluency, and comprehension. Now, where you see that the evidence bubbles, the ones that are filled in completely strong and the ones that are minimal, that doesn't mean that we should attend to those any less. That just means the research base is not as strong in that area. So we need more research to determine whether how strong we can make those claims, that those are things that we should be attending to. But you can see that when we look at the focusing on the sounds of language and on the connecting the letters and sounds of language, we have a great deal of evidence to support those instructional practices. Similarly, for writing, we have We have similar recommendations. One is to provide daily time for students to write, to teach students to use the writing process for a variety of purposes, to teach students to become fluent with handwriting, spelling, sentence construction, typing, and word processing, and to create an engaged community of writers. Now, I wanted to mention that as this kind of goes back a little bit to what Jason was saying, that there isn't one profile of reader. And so this is from a study I conducted with my advisor a number of years ago, where we kind of looked at the reading profiles of different kids based on their strengths and relative weaknesses in different areas connected to literacy. And so what we identified is that there are at least, there are probably more than this, but there are at least 6 different profiles that we were able to identify. There was a kind of below average across the board and above average across the board. And then there were also kids who had particular strengths in certain areas and relatively less strength in other areas. So they had a strength, one profile that had a strength in oral language, one that had a strength in decoding, one that had a strength in visual skills. And so the idea would be that instruction needs to be able to support kids based on their individual differences. And so kids who have a strength in decoding but are struggling in other areas, we might need to support those other areas. Students who have a strength in oral language but are struggling in other areas, we might need to support those other areas. And for kids who are below average across the board, we need to be focusing on all of those skills in our interventions. So how do we do this? This is what I'm sharing with you now is part of what we call the multi-tiered systems of support. And I'm focused here within MTSS if you've heard about it. MTSS is a whole systems, whole school approach. But within that, there's a specific part of it that is related to academic skills. And so this is related to academic response to intervention. And so in RTI, the idea is that what we need to do is we need to provide evidence-based practice at tier 1 that is differentiated for kids with different strengths and needs, and that meets the needs of all of the children. So tier 1 is for everybody. Then kids who are struggling, based on our progress monitoring data that we're collecting to find out how kids are progressing in school, for kids who are not responding or who are struggling within that tier 1 instruction, we need to provide them some targeted small group intervention. Many of the kids that we provide that tier 2 intervention will likely respond to that intervention if it is an evidence-based intervention that is implemented well for kids and also with some differentiation for kids' individual needs. If kids are still not responding to that targeted small group intervention, we need to then provide intensive intervention. And that intensive intervention is going to be similar to the type of intervention that Jason was discussing. Very everyday, multiple hours a day, really focused on specific skills and highly personalized if we can make it so. So the idea is that most kids, if provided effective instruction, will do just fine. They'll learn to read with no problems. If kids are struggling, we need to provide targeted instruction. And if kids are still struggling or severely struggling, we need to go to tier 3. Now, in some models of RTI, if kids are struggling at tier 1 and we're able to tell that it's a severe difficulty, we move them straight to tier 3. We don't kind of stop at tier 2 to find out. We just go straight to tier 3. And the idea is that some kids, it might just be that they need a little bit extra time to sort of get it, or they might need a little bit more individualized support. And for those, we want to try tier 2 before we go straight to tier 3. So for those kids in tier 2 and tier 3, for example, what do we know that we should be doing? And so again, this is from IES, the things that they recommend that we should be doing. One is that we should be screening all students for potential reading problems at the beginning and again at the end of the year, and typically also in the middle of the year as well. We should provide time for differentiated reading instruction for all students. So this is in that tier 1. Everybody should be getting differentiated instruction based on students' assessment of their current levels of reading. We should be providing intensive systematic instruction on up to 3 foundational skills for kids who score below benchmark. So that's that tier 2 intervention. We want to focus on the skills that they're struggling with so that we can try to catch them up. We want to monitor their progress at tier 2 and make sure that we're checking to see, are they progressing given the effective instruction that we're trying to deliver? And if not, we need to make changes based on that monitoring. And then finally, we need to provide intensive instruction on a daily basis that promotes the development of various components of reading proficiency to students who show minimal progress after a reasonable amount of time in tier 2. And that reasonable amount of time could be like roughly 8 to 16 weeks, depending on the program that we want to see. Are they making progress? And if not, we want to make changes. Now, this I've been talking a lot about elementary school students, but we also want to think about what do we do for kids who have either late emerging reading difficulties or who are still struggling in middle school. And so here we turn to some of the evidence from improving adolescent literacy, effective classroom and instruction on this topic. And so some of the recommendations that they make are actually sort of similar. Here we're going to provide explicit vocabulary instruction, direct and explicit comprehension strategy instruction, opportunities for extended discussion of text, we want to really focus because of, remember the downward spiral, we want to really focus to make sure that kids are also being supported in their motivation, engagement, growth mindset in terms of their ability to read. And then this is the important one, for kids who are struggling, even in adolescence, we need to be providing that intensive and individualized intervention for struggling readers by trained specialists to try to catch them up in the skills that they need to be able to acquire. So how do we do this? How do we decide what exactly it is that we should be doing within these interventions and at what point they should go to tier 2 or tier 3? What we really need to be doing is we need to be doing data-based individualization. And so this is really using our assessment data to identify the strengths and needs of kids and to monitor kids' progress across time so that we can identify what instructional programs do they need and how do we need to adapt their intervention. And especially for kids who are not progressing as we would like them to progress, we want to be able to use that data to individualize so we can make sure to really meet the kids, support their strengths, continue to build on their strengths, and then really meet their needs as well. And so here's an example of what this might look like. So this is some assessment data from a 4th grade classroom. And you can see that this is one child's report where they were assessed on a number of different skills, phonological awareness, phonics, high frequency words, et cetera, over 3 different time periods. And so you can see that there are certain things that the kid had all along, phonological awareness, for example, they were fine on. Here we have a kid who at the beginning of the year was not doing great in phonics, but started to catch up over time and is no longer sort of having the same level of difficulty. And then we also see that, that this is a child who is struggling with comprehension, and that's something that we might want to continue to focus on. So that's how we would use this sort of assessment data to identify what to focus on and who to focus on for. And teachers can get this kind of data for an entire class. So you can see this is just the start of a class list, but you would be able to look at straight down through, you know, how are all of the kids doing in phonological awareness? How are all of the kids doing in phonics? And you would be able to group kids accordingly to make sure that you have kids who, let's see, there's 2 kids right here that need some support with phonics. We're going to group these 2 kids together and provide some support, some tier 2 intervention support, specifically targeting phonics for these 2 kids. And so that's how we can use data to provide individualized instruction. So let's say we find that data and we see that those 2 kids are struggling in phonics, for example. What do we do? So one of the things that we can do as educators is we can provide more intensive intervention. So this might mean more time, longer duration, smaller groups. Some of, and Jason and I have talked about this, some of what kids need is just more attention so that they can focus on the specific skills at hand. It often needs to be more explicit and systematic. Lots of kids can pick up reading on their own without a whole lot of additional instructional support, but lots of kids really need a teacher to give them explicit information about how words are structured and how words are put together in sentences. They might also need opportunities, additional opportunities to practice and respond than they might normally get otherwise. So we want to give those kids lots of chances to try out the skills as they're developing them. We also want to ensure mastery and success. We don't want our kids to get frustrated because then they're going to give up. So we want to have kind of like little baby steps growing as the kids grow so that they eventually can take off and become more automatic. We also want to do more review so that kids, they often need a lot of reminders about what the skills are that they're learning so that they can come back to them over and over again. We want to give more feedback so that kids have a sense of what they're doing well and what they can improve on. And we want to give more scaffolding. We want to give lots of support up front and slowly take it away so that kids can become more independent in reading. I wanted to mention that because there's been some chatter around in parent groups that I've been part of, that, well, we should just dump RTI because RTI has been shown to not be effective. And so what I wanted to share about that is that, yes, it is true. There was an evaluation of RTI that found that there were no effects of using RTI on the literacy achievement of elementary school students. However, when we look at that assessment or that evaluation closer, we identified that school districts weren't really faithfully implementing all the aspects of RTI, that schools were leaving out different components, for example, progress monitoring. They weren't necessarily monitoring the implementation of the interventions and making sure that they were evidence-based. So there are a lot of components to RTI that if they're not in place, we might need to reevaluate the system itself, not just dump out RTI. And so what I would say is that there's much more work that needs to be done to ensure that RTI is effective and that it's been implemented effectively. Otherwise, it won't necessarily live up to the potential that it could have for kids. So I wanted to, sort of in the last part of my talk, I wanted to turn to tips for parents, like really thinking about the parent audience. How can you learn more about the RTI process and how to support kids in literacy? And so I wanted to share with you just a couple of both resources and questions that you can be asking. So first of all, I think it's important. I think schools don't really do a good enough job of involving parents in the RTI process. And so as parents, you definitely want to be involved in understanding what the RTI process is in the district and at the school. And so here's some questions that you can ask. You can say, does our school use the RTI process? If not, what are the plans to adopt one? How can I be involved in the various stages? So how can I know more information about my kids' core instruction, in their supplemental instruction if they need it? What interventions are being used, and are these scientifically based and being supported by research? And I can give you some resources where you can actually look up that information yourself. What is the length of time recommended for an intervention before determining a student is making adequate progress? We don't want kids lingering in intervention that is not showing to be effective for that child. We want to ask about, how do school personnel check to make sure the interventions are carried out as planned? So is there like a coach or a principal who's coming around to check that the interventions are being implemented faithfully? What techniques are being used to monitor student progress to make sure that they're checking to see whether or not kids are progressing within the intervention? Does the school provide parents with regular progress monitoring reports? So will you get a report similar to the ones that I showed you that can communicate with you about how your kids are doing in the different areas of literacy? And then at what point in the RTI process are parents informed about their due process rights under IDEA, including the right to request an evaluation for special education eligibility? Because RTI process is often used before it's determined whether or not a child needs special education. You want to understand at what point do we need to start having that conversation. And then so, I've got my kids, I've got 2 in hybrid learning and 1 in distance learning right now. So a lot of what we're thinking about is, what do we do with RTI and distance learning? And so I did want to comment on that real quick. When schools are closed, there needs to be an RTI MTSS home-based intervention plan. So I would encourage you to talk with schools about what is that plan for your students. Are the kids being assessed? Is their progress being monitored? Is there an intervention that's being provided to them? They can provide interventions remotely if needed. So, what is the plan for that? When schools reopen, there are going to be a lot of kids who are farther behind than we want them to be because they've been missing school, or they've not had the level of support that we would like them to have. Not because parents aren't trying, God knows we're trying, but just that they don't have that support from their teachers. And so we want to make sure that we're strengthening the academic screening and diagnostic capacity so that we can make sure our kids are, our teachers know what our kids' strengths and needs are, we know what our kids' strengths and needs are, and that there is a MTSS plan in place for RTI, the different tiers of intervention, to be provided immediately for our kids to catch up. A few additional things before I close. A lot of parents ask me, what can they do to help their kids at home? And I know a lot of parents are doing overtime right now on trying to support literacy for their kids. So what are some of the kinds of things that you can be thinking about? One, first you can be thinking about what areas does your child need improvement on? And if you don't know, you can talk with your teacher about getting assessment data. So I know that the teachers are administering assessments, particularly for those kids who are in hybrid. What are the children's strengths and needs? That can help you figure that out. There's a lot that goes into reading, from sounding out words to understanding what we read. If you're not sure which parts of those your kids are struggling with, ask the teachers, ask about what skills your child has difficulty with and how you can best help them at home. So once you gain an understanding of what areas are going better or not as well for your child, you can be thinking about how you might support them. So here's just some tips for different areas of the reading process that you can be thinking about. If your kids are struggling with sounding out words, you can help children learn their letters and sounds, as well as how to blend and segment them. So blending is just putting the sounds together smoothly to create a word, and segmenting is taking apart those sounds so that they can then put them in writing. And so that's a huge thing that parents can do, is just helping kids blend and segment words. It's a tricky part of the learning to read process. For word recognition, parents can also help kids learn sight words. You can put like Post-it notes with words like see and I, words that you want them to learn quickly and be able to recognize by sight without even having to think twice about it. You can create little word walls in your house and continually have your kids practice them. For fluency, you want to help children read smoothly and pay attention to making the words make sense as they read. And so you can have kids read out loud to you and just tell them to remind them to don't read too fast, don't read too slow, try to read like you talk. For kids who are having vocabulary, you can help children learn the meaning of new words. We talk a lot about creating a language-rich environment in the home. So where an environment where you use interesting words, you encourage children to use interesting words, you talk about words and what they mean, that can help build their vocabulary. And of course, if you're reading aloud to them, all the way, even my 7th grader still, we read aloud to him. You can point out words when you're reading aloud so that they can learn the meaning of new words. Similarly, with comprehension, you can help children ask and answer questions about text. You want them to be an actively engaged reader, where they're not just passively sitting back and listening to the text, but that they're actively becoming part of the reading process. And you can do that by scaffolding, asking and answering questions. And then you can also encourage wide reading of texts across genres. Though it's absolutely, and parents ask me this all the time, is it okay to support and encourage my child's interest if they're interested in reading comic books, or if they're interested in reading graphic novels, or interested in only reading about Superman? I think that's a great way to build on kids' interests, and then gradually introduce them to other text types as well, because it's going to be important that they not only know how to read, but that they know how to engage with text to learn as well. And then for writing. So for writing, we do want to help kids with handwriting and spelling, and as well as keyboarding. And so I know some schools sort of for a while stopped teaching spelling and handwriting and keyboarding. And those are things that you want to make sure that your kids are getting, because if they aren't fluent with handwriting and spelling or keyboarding, they're going to have difficulty writing. And if they have difficulty writing, they're not going to be able to get their ideas on the page. So you do want to help them become more fluent with that aspect of writing. Also for writing, you want to help children get their ideas down on papers. So you can have them think about how to organize their ideas, how to brainstorm what they want to get out, how to organize that use visuals, different kinds of ways that they can figure out what they want to communicate and practice communicating it, because we don't want to forget that writing is also a huge part of being able to communicate. And so we also want them to learn that writing is meant to be for authentic purposes. So getting kids engaged in writing for, like, for example, if they're into video games, they can do video game blogs, like trying to get them actually using and practicing those skills that they're learning. And then, you know, I know that we're on screen all the time right now, so it feels like no extra screen is needed. But there are a lot of technology applications that can support specific goals for students. And so thinking about, does the technology that I have access to meet the needs of my student? If not, what are the technology tools that I may need that match what I want my kids to continue to develop? And then finally, really support having a growth mindset and being motivated to read and engaged in reading, because as you saw in the beginning, if kids aren't motivated, they won't do it. And if they won't do it, then they're not going to get better at it. So I'm going to go ahead and end there. If you have questions and comments, go ahead and put them in the chat. And if you want to learn more about my research in particular, you can look at langlitlab.stanford.edu. And I also am excited that I'll get to be working with Jason on some of the work that he's doing, looking at the types of interventions that we can use to support kids with different individual strengths and needs, and how that affects the development of the brain. So definitely also please participate in those projects. We've got a lot to learn still.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. Oh my goodness. You've taken both on a great ride. The Q&A box is exploding. So I think, Nirmala, I don't know what you think, but we should just go, go down the list, right? One at a time. So we had that question, remember, about suggestion on intervention programs. What would you recommend as intervention programs? And the following up question would be, what would you recommend for supporting reading comprehension? So I guess you have the general question and then the more targeted question.
Right. So let's see, the general question about the specific Lucy Calkins units of study program that Palo Alto does use is that I would say, I mean, this is a very controversial issue right now, if you've been following it. Lucy Calkins actually came out with a memo suggesting that all of a sudden they now recognize the things that were wrong with the curriculum and are going to make some changes. I'm sure they will make a lot of money in the process by selling new versions and that kind of thing. So I'm a little suspicious of that. But what I can say is that there are aspects of the curriculum that are based on the science of reading, particularly things like the reading workshop and the writing workshop are well supportive of things like comprehension strategies, writing strategies, but they do not necessarily contain the components, all of the components of literacy that need to be addressed. For example, I would say that there isn't enough emphasis on phonics in the early years. There isn't enough emphasis on some of the strategic aspects of reading that need to be made more automatic. And so those are things that I think teachers can supplement with additional programs, and also with just really good instruction.
Thank you. And since we're on the Lucy Calkins topics, related to one of the tips that you are giving parents around spelling, currently in our district, I don't think it is mandatory to be teaching spelling. It's left at the discretion of teachers. So what would you recommend for parents to develop spelling if they realize that was an issue for their child?
Yeah, so I mean, schools really should be implementing a spelling program, because we know that if kids have difficulty spelling, that they're going to struggle when it comes to writing. And also because spelling is so intimately connected to phonics, you can get a reciprocal relationship by teaching spelling and also supporting phonics. So you can also actually affect their reading skills as well by teaching spelling. For parents, if the schools or if you find that they're not doing a good job with that, there are programs that parents can use to support their kids in spelling. What you're looking for is something that's really systematic and goes from easier skills to more difficult skills. And you're looking for something that is where spelling words are grouped not just by like a random spelling list of words, but that they're really grouped by feature. So for example, we're learning about short vowels, or we're learning about long vowels, or we're learning about our control vowels, for example. The words are grouped in that way so that kids can learn the patterns of the words. And I'll send some links to places where you can find those things.
Thank you. The next question is, can you talk about dyslexia and writing for kids who have well-developed reading skills?
So Jason, do you want to take that?
What was the question again? I didn't quite understand it.
I'm not sure either if the parent would like to clarify, but it's around, can you talk about dyslexia and writing for kids who have well-developed reading skills? So I'm assuming the mom.
About like, children who have fine reading skills but struggle with.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, so that wouldn't typically be called dyslexia. There's, it's really not an area that I have much expertise in. I had a colleague at University of Washington who studied writing disabilities, and that's where my knowledge ends. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of a child who can read efficiently but still has difficulty with writing, I would want to know, so when you kind of look at the model of writing that I shared in the beginning, I would want to probe farther into what are the specific areas that they may be struggling with, and then how could I then support those specific areas? Like, is it a spelling issue? Is it a writing fluency issue? Is it I spend so much time on my handwriting that I lose all my ideas once I try to get them on the page. So that's the kind of thing I would probably try to figure out next in order to be able to provide recommendations for instruction.
Yeah, that's exactly what the mom is talking about. It's actually maybe a child that has, she's saying, most intervention with dyslexia focus primarily on reading, but can you actually talk about the work for kids, even though they're diagnosed with dyslexia, who cannot process their thoughts to write and who struggle with spelling and writing mechanics? I think bottom line, the question is, what is it that we can do to support with writing? A lot of research has been done around structured literacy for reading. Is there an equivalent for the process to teach writing in general, including spelling?
Yeah, many of the programs, the sort of structured literacy programs, do include writing elements. So for example, Wilson has kids doing dictation, Orton Gillingham has a writing component. So they are part of them, but those are definitely places that we could build up. I think a lot of it is, again, that explicit structures for how to scaffold and support the various skills in literacy that kids need for writing in particular.
There's a question, is Lexia considered a good form of assessment for literacy?
So is that the Lexia Rapid Assessment or the Lexia program itself?
I think PAUSD were doing the rapid assessment for middle school. So probably, yeah.
I think if I can chime in, I think they're talking about the Lexia program that's currently being used in the district. They're using Core 5 for elementary, and they're using Power Up for secondary. And as part of this program, there is an assessment that is embedded because the program is going through levels. So they get the kids to do an assessment. So the question that is being asked is this assessment the same one that, the rapid that Lexia has done?
Yeah, so from my understanding, the Lexia Rapid Assessment is not the one that's like embedded in the Lexia Core 5 program and the Power Up program. The Lexia Rapid Assessment does provide information that would be very similar to the data that I showed you. So it does provide, like, for different component skills, how are the kids doing compared to their peers. In the Lexia Core 5 program, that one gives like a quick like placement screener so that it can put kids within a certain level within the Lexia program. And that program does break down the skills. It does have some good elements to it. I mean, I have to admit that my kids think it's boring. So that's going to be a problem when we get to the motivation engagement aspect of it. But it does have the pieces of like blending and segmenting in words, putting words into sentences that we know to be effective.
And since you talked about motivation, there's several questions here, like how do you motivate a child to like to read? The person says, my fourth grader would rather do anything but read. And then we had another one. He goes, how do you motivate a kindergartner to try to read when he's happy to keep listening, to us read to him? So this idea of motivation is a key question for a lot of parents.
Yeah, it's huge. And I think it's a real struggle for many of us. And I think you would take different approaches for the kids at different ages. For the kindergartner, a lot of what's going on there is, well, it depends on what you think is going on with your child, but often a lot of times we see that kids, they get frustrated by the thought of doing it wrong. Like they see their parents reading easily. Their parents pick up a book, they read it. And then when they're faced with a book, they're like, what the heck is this? And so I think if that is the case, really trying to make reading an enjoyable and pleasant and fun opportunity, building off of, so like some simple strategies, building off of what kids are interested in and what they know. So like making books about their family where they can even put in pictures themselves or words themselves so that they see that there is a point to this. Learning to read is very hard. And if you're just focused on like the end goal is to learn to sound out words, that does not feel satisfying for a kid. But if you focus on, you're going to read words in order to get to the part where you get to enjoy this or learn something interesting or read something cool, that's the part that you really want to foster. And I definitely encourage parents not to get into like power struggles and battles about reading because it'll just reinforce their sort of negative attitude towards reading, but try to like find ways in. So for example, my kid was really into Magic the Gathering. And so like I would buy him tons of books about Magic the Gathering. And so he would read that when he wouldn't necessarily read his regular schoolwork. And that was like a way in, like I can say, okay, now you're into fantasy. Well, let's try this fantasy book that's somewhat related and just kind of ease them into, building on things that they enjoy. And I think, yeah, so that's a similar question for the older kids is also like trying to find hooks of things that they enjoy and showing them that reading has a purpose that will satisfy them.
So another question is, how do you identify the needs for reading and writing support? Is this something teacher identifies and then report to a specialist?
Yes, the teacher should be doing screening at the beginning of every year, as well as for kids who on the screening assessment showed initial difficulties, they should be progress monitoring them roughly every 8 weeks or so. Definitely by midpoint, they should be collecting that assessment data and they should be communicating it back to parents as well as to the specialists.
Sorry, when you talk about monitoring weekly, what do you have in mind?
Oh no, monitoring roughly every 8 weeks, so that you give a follow-up assessment every 8 weeks. I mean, in some RTI models, they do, particularly for kids who are in tier 2 intervention, they do provide very quick assessments. They're like timed fluency-based measures. They do that every week to see if kids are progressing. But at the sort of tier 1 level, usually every 8 weeks, every 16 weeks, and in mid-year.
And using the 5 or 6 KPIs that you showed us, phonemic awareness, phonics.
Yeah.
And what about, you talked about for kids that are going through intervention, so I'm thinking about our IEP kids. You mentioned how important it was to monitor the data, and I think I recall you said monthly. Could you give us some example of what data you would recommend parents to ask? I'm thinking mainly reading and writing.
Yeah, so in some school districts, like the assessment that I showed you, they have kids take that assessment on a regular basis, and it's adaptive enough and has enough versions of it that you can keep taking it regularly, and it'll show kids growth. They actually have growth index measures over time. If the school district doesn't use those kinds of assessments or have access to those kinds of assessments, there are other measures that schools can use, like even paper-based or one-on-one measures, so that they're providing information about how kids are progressing in the various skills. And that's really important because, like I said, we don't want kids to be in intervention that they're not responding to. And so if they're not responding, we need to change something. So if you see that they're not reading any words faster per minute over the course of an 8-week intervention, then we need to make a change.
So we have another question. My son received tier 2 intervention using LLI for a whole year and made no growth. In 2nd grade, he became eligible for an IEP and then had access to structured literacy. After a year of structured literacy, he closed the gap. I'm confident that if we had access to structured literacy in tier 1 in kindergarten and grade 1, he would not have needed special education. Why is there such resistance to structured literacy tier 1 in K through 2?
That's a great question. I mean, a lot of it is, it's complicated by a lot of history. Jason and I were running a science of reading group where we're talking about the history of the so-called reading wars. What I can say is that not all, it is true that not all kids need phonics. Some kids learn, I mean, I can, anecdotally, my daughter's in kindergarten, she really needs phonics. There's another kid in her class who's already reading at a 3rd grade level, never had phonics in his life. There are some kids who can pick it up. But the problem is that there are a lot of kids who really need that explicit instruction. And often even kids who do end up picking it up on their own would have gotten it quicker or more efficiently with phonics. And so that's why we say, it's best to give structured phonics programs to everybody. It doesn't need to be in as high doses for some kids as other kids, but we should be providing that with everybody to help with building the efficiency of learning to read quickly and also like shortening that frustration time, kind of moving them into fluency as quickly as possible.
So it's 6:31. I think if you're okay, we can pick 2 more questions and then we'll wrap up. Okay, and so for all the others, what we've agreed we'll do is we'll just print out and prepare a Q&A that we'll send with the presentation. It was stated that we're not wired for reading. Can you say a bit about developmental readiness for reading?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I often get asked, is the answer just starting earlier and earlier and earlier? And like anything in development, there's a sequence of things that you want to be well developed before you layer on the next thing. So learning to read depends on spoken language skills and language comprehension and understanding, as Rebecca mentioned, of like the sound structure of language. That speech can be segmented into kind of its atomic units, phonemes, specific sounds. That these atomic units of speech can be blended together to make words. So there's a series of precursors to the process of beginning learning to read. So a lot of those skills, like thinking about oral language skills, just general language development. I mean, there's, fostering a rich language environment from a very early age, obviously is a great thing to do. And, round 3, 4, 5 in those, early in the preschool years, starting to develop some of the foundational skills upon which literacy is built. But I don't think there's any data suggesting that beginning to read at an earlier age than is typical is going to set kids off on a better trajectory. And it's really like you want to think about this in a developmental context and work on the foundational skills, build up the knowledge, and some kids are ready for it earlier than others, and so I'll start off with that. Then on the other side of it, though, if children are really struggling in the first couple of years of elementary school, that's at the point when you should start worrying and intervening. Just because I said that there's no reason to rush it early on. What science has also shown is that in first and second grade, if children are still really struggling, they're likely to continue struggling if they don't get additional support. And so is related to what Rebecca was saying about the importance of response to intervention, or under a different name, multi-tiered systems of support, where there's constant monitoring of children's progress with increases in the intensity and directness of instruction as children demonstrate difficulties.
Jason, going off of that, what do you recommend for middle school students that are behind in reading and writing, and students who have slipped through into high school without being supported appropriately?
Yeah, so I'll comment on that briefly, and then maybe Rebecca wants to add anything. So, look, the research shows that interventions are most effective when they're delivered early on. There's there's a whole body of work supporting the idea of catch them before they fall. That rather than waiting for children to have years of struggling and go down the downward spiral that Rebecca suggested, like it's better to just start with increased support early on. Now that should not be taken to suggest that that hope is lost later on. And I think at some point it comes to like a decision for the family of of what children need. But in our intervention program, it was a small sample, so we can't say this. We're looking now to see how this will generalize in a larger group, but it was equally effective. We saw the same magnitude of growth in the 13-year-olds that were in the program as we did in the 7-year-olds that were in the program. So, if you have children that are in middle school or high school and are still struggling and have the time to commit to an intensive intervention program, they're still highly effective. I think the difficulty is it might, at that age, is probably harder for these to be woven into the typical school curriculum. Now, Rebecca, do you have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, just briefly, I think for kids who are significantly behind in middle school, I think they do need to be provided with a highly structured intensive program. They're going to have more to catch up on than kids that we were able to catch earlier on. However, that, as Jason said, just to reiterate, they can make progress and they can become good readers. They might still struggle with fluency in certain areas of reading, but they can become good readers with the right interventions. But I think that the mistake that schools make sometimes is providing kids those intensive interventions while taking kids out of their content area instruction. And that's not a good scene, because many of those kids who have reading difficulties are actually quite bright in other areas. And if they don't have access to the content, then they're going to fall further behind in other areas. So it really should be supplemental to their regular education program. And if I had my druthers, schools would provide those programs in either after school settings or before school settings, where it's an additional support to the content area. And in those content areas, the kids should be provided with assistive technology tools to be able to access the content. So they need to be able to have their texts that can be read to them. They need to be able to have highlightable text, all kinds of options for kids, voice to text typing, so that kids can participate in the content areas at their grade level.
Thank you. That's really helpful. And I think this will be our final question for tonight. If a child has been identified with dyslexia, but the school insists on labeling her as an English learner and keeps in tier 2 type help, how does a parent counter this? Can you advocate?
I think that the biggest thing I would ask for is I would want to have access to the assessment data and find out how they're determining that the language skills are what's at issue. And I would want to know that they have also administered English proficiency assessments, if that's within that are looking at reading, writing, speaking, and listening, so that you can compare what the issues are and try to really identify the specific needs that children have. And to be perfectly honest, the field has not developed good measures for really being able to disentangle what is just a natural language progression that kids are developing through versus they're struggling in reading. And so teachers might not have the tools that they need to do this, but one good method is comparing the literacy data and the English language data and trying to, and also if you have it available, the home language data to be able to try to compare how they are across these measures and where the particular pitfalls may be.
Those are really helpful.
So Rebecca, I'll ask a last question and then I'll wrap up. When we talked about middle school and how difficult it is for to help middle school because of their schedule, do you have examples of schools or districts that have done that successfully?
Yeah, so actually a colleague of mine, Sharon Vaughn, has worked in Texas. She's at the University of Texas, Austin, where with programs where kids have, kids who need extra literacy support, they actually have a block in their day where that's like one of their subject areas. So they're getting all of their regular subject areas, but they would have this as like, instead of an elective, for example. Often I say that if kids are struggling in reading, they're probably not going to be able to easily acquire a second language a second or third language at the same time. So that's one possibility, is substituting it as a language, and you can actually even treat it as like a little linguistic school where they're learning the functions of language, but creating that time within the schedule rather than trying to like borrow it from English language arts, for example. Thank you.
I think PAUSD does use the elective model. What I don't know is in Texas, would they have like a reading specialist in middle school?
Yes.
Okay. Well, look, thank you so much for sharing your expertise. I mean, we still have many questions. What I wanted to say for those that still have questions, we have our put some emails where you can contact us. We've proposed some additional resources. If Allison, you would like to put the slide up. What else? So yes, and then, well, we've talked about it. For those that wants to work with Jason, you can sign up on his website. There is going to be a board update in 2 weeks, November 10th, where the district will talk about what we are doing at PAUSD to support kids with dyslexia. If you want to know more yourself and educate yourself, I highly recommend the California Dyslexia Guidelines. I recommend Emily Hanford documentary. She's a journalist that has been researching dyslexia for a few years now. And anyway, we've listed quite additional resources: the Reading Link, Decoding Dyslexia, IDA, the International Dyslexia Association, but most importantly, Palo Alto CAC is here, and the EVP of Education provided also their email. So I know it's 6:42. If we were in real life and not in Zoom live, we would hang out for more questions. I think we're gonna free Jason and Rebecca. But if you have questions for us, CAC and PTAC, we're happy to stay behind. I don't know if we can open up to the participant if for everybody to see videos. But anyway, if people want to stay and there's still questions that we feel we haven't answered and want to address them, we can do that. And then for the others that we haven't addressed, we will collect them, and please put into the tiny URL your contact details, and we will respond, send the Q&A and send the slides. Nirmala, did I forget anything?
That's a good, Laurence. Thank you. No, I think we've covered it all.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. I'm going to run to put the kids to sleep, but this was
Me too.
great.
Bye. Good night.
Thank you so much.